Thank you. Welcome today to our terrorism course here at DWU. We have a special guest speaker today, South Dakota's Director of Homeland Security. We're privileged to have them come and have had the director come for the past two times we've held the course in 2013 and in 2011 as well, so it's a real pleasure to welcome them back and have a tradition, a connection with the public agency here for our students. I will let the director introduce himself for the most part, so this is Steve Pluta.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm always pleased to go out and pretty much conduct these sorts of presentations. It gets me out of the office because I know for people that sit in the office a lot, one of the things they want to do is get out of there. So this is good for me and go out and meet the public. But I think this is also an opportune time to talk about what the state has been doing in light of the recent events that have been taking place across the world and in the United States. So what I'd like to do for about the next hour or so this afternoon is just talk about what our office does. Keep in mind, we are not part of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. We are part of South Dakota under the Department of Public Safety. So what I'm going to do is talk about our functions, specifically what I do, specifically what our office does, talk about some of the things that the state has done to prepare not only for in the event of terrorism, but also hazardous weather events, and then go into a little bit about the threat that we face today, unfortunately, and then things that you can do to basically help keep the state safe. So at any point in time, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. I know it's after lunch, people probably ate, and if I keep talking, pretty soon the eyelids are going to start dropping. So again, you don't have to wait towards the end to ask any questions. So at any point in time, please feel free to ask. So with that, I'd like to start off with and just talk about our office. Our parent organization is the South Dakota Department of Public Safety, which was formed circa about 2004. And it does encompass quite a few organizations with it. And talk about my role and function in that organization. I'll get to that in a little bit, and then the threats. So when people think about DPS, what do you think of? Anyone? State Patrol. Yeah, why State Patrol? Okay, they're most visible, and plus you get that, heart rate that goes up every time you see them in your rearview mirror when they pull up behind you. So State Patrol, that is one of them, but it's actually quite a few organizations. We look at driver's licensing is also a big part of DPS. Fire marshals, they actually go out and they conduct fire investigations. Anytime there's a fire, they work very closely with the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms if there's an explosion resulting in a fire. Inspections, weights, and measures. Under the inspection division, we have people, state inspectors, that actually go out and they inspect truck scales, they inspect the gas pumps, they inspect daycare centers. And very critical job because a lot of the revenue from the gas sales that the state gets, they have to make sure that not only the consumer is getting what they're paid for, but also that the gas that's basically stated that it's 87 octane, that's basically what it is. So they actually go out and inspect those sorts of things. Office of Highway Safety, very important because they actually maintain some of the safety records, and based on some of the efforts that the state and local authorities take, that relates to how much funding the state gets. So they pretty much have to keep tabs on things like accidents and those sorts of things. And they also administer federal highway funding grants to local communities. Highway Patrol, that's a big one. And yes, that's the one that they are most visible. And that comprises a large portion of the personnel for actually under Department of Public Safety. Motor carrier, also they fall under Highway Patrol, but they actually do the inspections of the tractor trailers that are coming into the state and make sure that there's safety enforced. And then Office of Emergency Management, that's another big one. And we, at least my office, works very closely with Office of Emergency Management. These are the folks that actually do the planning and preparation for any large-scale natural weather events that occur, and they also manage some grant programs throughout their program. And then lastly, State Radio. Falls under Highway Patrol, but I think it's still worth mentioning because they actually work with our Bureau of Information and Telecommunications to make sure that if there is an event, that the radios are operable and the communications can be maintained. So, as far as my office, my primary function is that of the Homeland Security Advisor. When DHS started allotting grant money back in probably 2002, 2003, they set up a lot of requirements that, hey, if the state is going to be receiving this money, this is what we want you to do. And some of those parameters were a little loose back at that time as far as what the funds could be used for. But with as the Homeland Security Advisor, my primary goal is to relay any threats that are faced by the state directly to the governor. So if there's any indication that there is a terrorist threat, that something's coming into the state that might be hazardous, my goal is to relay that to the governor. And then if the governor asks for any advice as far as what we should do in terms of specific threats, that's where I come into play. The majority of the time, though, however, fortunately, we haven't really come to that point where I'm calling the governor at like 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's a good thing. But that's one of my roles. The other one actually is that of state administrative agent. And in other words, I'm the grant administrator for all the funding that comes in from Department of Homeland Security. And with that grant administration, this is where I think we're going to I'll take a little bit of time to explain it. Just to give you an idea, if you take a look at that graph, basically after 9/11, the state got close to $20 million, that went up. But as the years progressed, we've received less and less money into the state. 2015 isn't on there, but this past year we received $3.7 million for the state to address Homeland Security issues. And when I'm talking about Homeland Security issues, it's not specifically driven at anti-terrorism efforts. It's a combination of all hazards. The way the grant works is that 80% of that funding is supposed to go back to the local communities, and then 20% is retained by the state. Some of that covers management and administrative costs, and then state projects. And as I talk about grants, we'll go into a little bit more in detail about that. So as you can see, we've basically gotten less and less each year. I will say that for grant year 2015, we got a $1,500 increase. So that's really not much, but it's better than nothing. The way Department of Homeland Security calculates this grant funding is based on risk. So they take a look at what risk each state faces. Usually it's based on population and plus what the state has in terms of critical infrastructure, such as things like defense industrial base, iconic things, such as Mount Rushmore. So it's not really a very calculated risk analysis, but like I said, it's based on population because the figure here is basically, the thought process is wherever they have a large population, that basically faces the biggest threat. I mean, bottom line. So what we've done with this grant, and like I said, there have been people much smarter than I that basically have driven this program, and looking towards the future and sustainability of the state. When this program first developed, people in leadership position in state government said, okay, what can we do to prepare the state for any type of activity, be it terrorism or a natural event? So when the funding started out, they had a board that basically is described as a senior advisory board comprised of senior law enforcement officials from across the state, as well as individuals from other state government agencies. And they decided, okay, we're going to get this pot of local funding. Let's pull some money out and set up specific programs that we can dedicate this funding to. Regardless of how much we get, let's make sure that we can maintain these 3 programs. And so one of the programs that they decided to support right off the bat, talk about that, is the Fusion Center. As part of the DHS funding, each state is supposed to have a Fusion Center. Has anyone heard of the Fusion Center in here before? Okay, what do they do? Any idea? Saw some nods. Be brave. Okay. Fusion Center basically, I hate to use the term intelligence because people misconstrue that and think it's all about spying. Realistically, it's not. And what they do is like a one-stop shop for information that comes into the state. talk a little bit about these guys. So the Fusion Center is connected directly to these agencies that you see here. These are the 16 agencies that make up the U.S. intelligence community. So if there is a threat that is coming into a particular state, the Fusion Center has reach-back capability to determine the extent of that threat and then pass that threat out to local law enforcement agencies, myself, and the governor. Not only are we talking about terrorist threat, but we're also talking about criminal threats, things that, like say, for example, if there is some drug information, people making drug runs through the state, try to keep the citizenry safe. Right now, the Fusion Center is focused primarily on that anti-terrorism and law enforcement capability. But with the addition recently of a retired firefighter from Sioux Falls, we're actually now making that expansion out to EMS and fire. Reason being, a lot of these folks, especially EMS and fire, they may respond to a call. There might be some issues there that might be relevant to their safety. So we're trying to push that safety message out, not only to law enforcement, but also to other first responders. So that program has been in existence. Like I said, the Fusion Center is growing. We're not only making it specifically for law enforcement, but we're trying to reach out. We're also reaching out to health department. And eventually, as the Fusion Center grows, we hope to expand that a little more to some of the private partners. One thing I should mention too, cybersecurity, that's one of the things we are addressing through the Fusion Center there as well. Bureau of Information and Telecommunications has graciously provided us with a person with cyber expertise, so that way if there is some sort of cyber threat that applies nationally, we can make that reach back, conduct that analysis, and get that message out not only to people within state network, but also to the private enterprise. Another key dedicated funding source is Task Force 1. You may have heard of them, previously known as regional response teams. But Task Force 1 is comprised of 4 fire departments, full-time fire departments: Aberdeen, Rapid City, Sioux Falls, and Watertown. And just to give you a little idea of what their capability and what we do with their funding, I got a little video clip here. Does anyone here not like dogs? Everybody's a dog lover, right? Okay, so I'll play you a little video clip of Cisco. And this goes to building capability within the state.
The Rapid City Fire Department and South Dakota Task Force 1 are excited to announce our first disaster-certified canine for South Dakota. Cisco is a live-find, air-scenting canine. He is newly certified in Type 3 Urban Search and Rescue and has a Type 1 certification in Wilderness Search and Rescue. What does that all mean? Cisco will find live subjects in the wilderness and in disasters. We've worked hard over the last year to get this accomplished. Cisco is a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois. He was born in Connecticut and did his basic obedience training in New Hampshire before coming to South Dakota in May 2014. At that time, he was paired up with his handler, Jeremy Gibbons. With the grant money Rapid City Fire Department received, we were able to purchase Cisco and hire master dog trainer Johnny Joyce to help train dog and handler together. Over the last year, we have worked on obedience, direction, control, building searches, scent work, and disaster and wilderness scenarios. In March 2015, Cisco and Scott, our training assistant, went to Memphis, Tennessee to complete the FEMA Canine Search Specialist training through Tennessee Task Force 1. Cisco is capable of responding to tornadoes, building collapse, search and rescue assignments, or any situation where search for a live victim is required. Cisco is available for local, regional, or statewide assignments. He is registered as a member of the South Dakota Task Force 1. If you would like to utilize Cisco for an operation, please contact your county emergency manager or contact the Rapid City Fire Department directly at 394-4180. Also, be sure to check out Cisco's Facebook page for more photos and videos.
I don't know how many people here have pets and have their own Facebook page. I don't know. It's probably a first, but this sort of goes to what I was talking about earlier in helping the state prepare for any sort of eventuality, whether it be man-made or natural disaster. Cisco was purchased with DHS grant funding under the program which I spoke earlier. And so these sorts of things, like say for example, God forbid there's a terrorist event and there's an explosion and there's victims somewhere that have to be sought for where perhaps it's a little too dangerous to send a person in, Cisco's trained for that. Same thing with a tornado. If there's some people trapped in a building, Cisco can be utilized to find live victims. So let me back up here a little bit. So some of the other things we talked about with Task Force 1, very well trained, specific people from each of those fire departments trained in urban search and rescue, ice and swift water rescue, structure collapse rescue, hazardous materials response. Primarily that's one of their main bailiwicks is the hazmat response. And then high angle breach and rescue. Now keep in mind, all of these are specialties. So within each fire department, there are people that are specially trained to accomplish this. And DHS funding, the state funding for the local funding has been used to pay, actually has been utilized to pay for that training. So just to give you an idea, how many people here went to the Sturgis rally this past year? Anyone? Or at least no one that wants to admit it. So let me tell you, as far as for that rally, state and local entities really worked hard to plan for that. And as part of that training, the task force actually sent people from Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, and Watertown for that week to actually conduct training on their own. So that way, if there were any type of event, that hazmat team would be able to be ready to roll a lot closer than actually driving 6 hours or whatever the case may be from Watertown. So this is just a picture of one of the trainings that was conducted. They're actually doing simulated rescue from one of the canyons down in Rapid City. And here's another one that they practiced during the week. They're actually looking at breaching through concrete while working on ropes. I don't know how many people here do mountain climbing or any sort of rappelling, but let me tell you, that takes a lot of not only mental acuity, but physical stamina to be working a jackhammer and trying to punch through concrete. So these are the sorts of things that they actually train for, so that way if there is some sort of event, again, be it man-made or a terrorist event, we actually have that capability within the state for these folks to respond. Any questions about the task force, folks? Yeah.
You're saying that it's funded at this point by federal money. Yeah, you're saying it's funded by federal money. What's the follow-up plan if that goes away?
Well, the question was, this is funded by federal money. What's the follow-up plan if it does go away? Fortunately, the fire departments have a very strong leadership, and so even when we fund some of the equipment, they basically put that into their budget down the road for replacement. So they are looking at other potential avenues. So there is a plan as far as getting into the details of it. I'm not that specific of them with each individual department, but we do realize that at some point in time this federal funding may go away, so we have to look towards the future to see what else is out there. But good question. So I talked a little bit about the task force, and the last dedicated program that we support is actually the SWAT teams. There are several law enforcement agencies throughout the state that have SWAT teams. And keep in mind, these are officers who perform these duties as collateral duty. They're not paid full-time to do this. And so looking at that anti-terrorism, that counterterrorism aspect of it, we actually provide funding for training so that way they can go and do this training. And one thing I do like that they are doing within this state, it doesn't matter if it's Rapid City or Yankton or Aberdeen or Sioux Falls, these teams are getting together and they're training together as one. And I think that's very important because if they have to respond to an incident, they're talking about utilizing the same tactics, operating on the same sheet of music, for lack of a better term. So that way they don't say, well, we do this way in Aberdeen, or we're going to respond this way in Rapid City. Because the time to discuss how you're going to do something is not when you arrive on scene. And so with these trainings that they do jointly, as basically as departments, I think it goes a long way, so that way if something does happen, they know how each team is going to operate, and they could actually flow together a lot better if they actually have to interchange team members. So here's a picture, actually Pennington, Rapid City, Pennington County. Captain Jay Evanson is actually on the right, and he's done a very great job. He's one of the folks that we go to help administer this program as far as when they meet. They set up what trainings the SWAT teams want to go to or what trainings are needed. It could be something like basic SWAT officer, advanced officer, sniper, less lethal munitions, whatever the case may be. So they pretty much decide as a group which trainings would be most beneficial so that way they could sustain operations. Any questions about the SWAT teams? No? Okay. Here's just some pictures taken from an active shooter exercise our office put together actually back in 2014. And so you had Highway Patrol and you had Pure PD and DCI. They had their SWAT folks there, and there's actually some pictures of actually apprehending the active shooter during that exercise. Okay. So local funding. So we talked about that one pot of money pretty much that we use to cover those 3 dedicated programs, Fusion Center, Task Force 1, and SWAT teams. So the rest of the money actually goes out to the local entities. And the way the state is broken up, the state has 6 regions. And when the money comes in, using that DHS risk formula, we break up the funding per 6 regions. Keep in mind, because some regions have more population than others, some regions will get more money than others. So when you're talking about like Region 1, which encompasses pretty much Minnehaha County, they get a majority, they get a good chunk of the funding, as does Region 2 and Region 4. What happens is when the money comes in, we take a look at investment justifications. In other words, we take a look at and we see what areas need to be addressed for the coming year. And it could be anything from anti-terrorism efforts to early warning notifications, perhaps to cybersecurity. We do the investment justifications, we advertise an open application period, and then once we do that, it's either the county emergency manager, any law enforcement agency, any school, or any city or municipality can actually put in an application for whatever project they think is important. Keep in mind, it has to have some anti-terrorism nexus. And we review that application. Once it meets the basic review approval, and they're not asking for something that we realistically cannot purchase, that does not appear on the authorized equipment list that's put out by DHS, we then forward those to the regional committees. The regional committees in each region are made up of the chief law enforcement officer and the county emergency manager from that region. They sit down as a group and they decide, based on the limited funding, which project goes forward. And that's a very tough thing to do, because I will tell you, in Region 1, we only had approximately $530-some thousand that was available to that region. We received applications in excess of $1.2 million. So they had to decide which projects would move forward. Once those projects move forward, once they're approved, then we sign individual award agreements either with the school or the county emergency manager or that law enforcement agency. And then they're given approximately 6 months to complete purchases for equipment, or 1 year to complete a project that would require them to do an installation such as a warning siren. Couple things that we fund. Radios, it's very key that we fund those because we need to have that interoperability between fire departments, law enforcement, and county emergency managers in the event of a terrorist event, or for that matter, a natural weather event. Generators, we fund generators, portable and fixed, primarily for shelters, because if there's some sort of natural weather event where pretty much people are displaced from their homes, there's someplace that they need to go, especially during ice storms. We want to make sure those people are kept warm and they're kept safe, and that they have access to basic needs such as water facilities, cooking food, those sorts of things. Warning sirens are a big one. We recently started using ArcGIS mapping so that we could actually put on a map all of the items that we had funded within each town, within each municipality. And part of that reason is so that if one county needs a portable generator, they don't have it, they would know which county they could call to try to get that portable generator transported to their facility or to their community. Access control is a big one, primarily for schools. I'll just say this, that cameras are great, but I will tell you this, that cameras don't do anything to prevent people from coming in unless you lock the doors, because I know that they're good for evidence, for those sorts of things, but unless you control who's coming in, it's a little hard to stop things from going on. So with access control, we do fund schools for projects, everything from the earphones and electronic locks to security film on the window so someone tries to, break through there. And then dive team equipment, just as another one here. Just to give you some pictures here, the generator off to the left, actually that's also for the Emergency Operations Center, so that way if there is an event and there's a loss of power, the Emergency Operations Center can continue it again if there's a shelter involved. With the dive team, we not only purchase the trailer, but also the gear, some of the equipment, some of the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. And if you're asking yourself, why are we buying these things? Again, it's to build capability. And I'm not just talking about the larger municipalities, I'm talking about some of the smaller towns that are remote in the rural areas. And if you're asking yourself, why are we spending money there? Well, it's pretty simple because, granted, people in the city, they're entitled to certain things too, but what about the people that are way off, in these small towns that may not necessarily have these resources? You can't wait, for a larger municipality like Sioux Falls or Rapid City or Aberdeen, 45 minutes to 2 hours for someone to come up, especially if it's one of these life and death situations. So we also need to make sure that we can at least give these folks some of the tools so that way they can maintain at least some sense of response and maintain that life safety until more help would arrive. Forward-looking infrared thermal imaging camera, and you'll see a lot of those, the sirens pretty much for warning sirens. And again, early warning and notification is very important, especially here in this state when we're talking about severe weather events. Okay, off to the left, I believe that's Pennington counties. We also do specialty vehicles. We have had projects for UTVs, especially for those that have been equipped with tracks. If you take a look at what happened with Winter Storm Atlas several years ago, wheeled vehicles couldn't just make it. The region decided as a project, hey, you know what, this is where we fell short in a particular capability, so how about if we, as counties, put in for these tracked vehicles? And as part of that, I will tell you, it's not where the county is actually just holding onto it and hoarding that equipment. They also have a sharing agreement, so that way if an additional county, or for that matter, some other county in the state needed that resource for a particular response, they would be able to provide it. And then lastly, portable generators. Finding the portable generators are very good because of the fact that we'll pay for the transfer switches that can be hooked up to the buildings, but with the portable generators, that way you're not wasting, a $10,000 to $50,000 generator that's stationary, where if some other county could, be using it during a natural event, that they could actually put it on wheels and haul it over there. Does this stuff make sense to you? Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So switching gears here a little bit, I'd like to talk about the threats that the state faces, and not only the state, but this country. And the biggest one is the international terrorism. Can anyone tell me what's changed over the recent years in terms of the international terrorist threat? What's actually made it worse? Yeah, thank you. Social media. social media has made it a lot worse because now the reach has actually gone worldwide. As opposed, it used to be face to face and basically, it could be that radicalization attempt, whether it be in a social setting. Here, you don't really need that anymore. They can utilize that through social media. The other big change is that before it used to be coming from ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. It used to be, come to Syria, you'll have a good time, we'll go kill people. Now it's like, well, you know what? You don't need to come to Syria. You can do this in your own home. You can do this in your own backyard. And unfortunately, that message resonates with some people here in the United States. And so that's why this threat has evolved. It's changed. And the other thing behind that, with that social media and internet, these people, they want to kill you, but they'll also put out instructions on how you can make your own tools to kill other people, whether it be improvised explosive devices or welding steel rods to your vehicle so you could run them into a crowd, or just buying weapons and going out and killing people. So the threats have evolved over the years, and the use of the internet, the use of the social media have actually made that a little harder for law enforcement to try to keep tabs on. Talk a little bit about domestic terrorism. Obviously, we still have the right-wing groups here in the United States. You have sovereign citizens that basically believe that they should not really be subject to any federal or state laws. They have killed law enforcement in the past. Then you have other right-wing extremists that have the white supremacy attached to it, or black separatists. And then you're also dealing with some of the environmental groups here that basically, figure that animals have more rights than people, and they go out and either, burn housing, or I remember years ago it used to be where they'd go out and they'd burn all these big SUVs to try to protect the environment. I don't know what they were talking about there, but those groups do exist. So you can see we do face a variety of threats, and at this point I'll be glad to open it up to any questions before we move on to the next segment, if there's anything that anyone, yes.
This past spring, there was an article regional that went national regarding South Dakota, and I believe probably some of the funds, maybe not, but about the over-militarization of our police departments. The idea of, Custer County having grenade launchers, Fall River, they're getting these Bearcats, getting these kinds of, how do you balance what kind of armament? I mean, obviously there are always threats, but what are the monies? Does a department of 12 people need 18 ARs, or those kinds of questions? How do you balance what a police force gets?
Well, I will tell you that with the DHS funding, that funding specifically cannot be used to purchase firearms or munitions. So I think what you're referring to is the 1033 program, which is military surplus, which the military has a program that allows law enforcement agencies to get at minimal cost some of these excess items. So I can't really speak to what each individual agency needs, but if you go back to what happened in San Bernardino, and I hate to use that as an example because people obviously lost their lives, a lot of innocent people, but I think what was seen on the news, the amount of firepower coming from those two terrorists shooting at law enforcement, which basically a Crown Victoria or Chevy Caprice can't stop those bullets. And so as far as balancing, I think it's really up to those law enforcement agencies to look at what threats they have in their area and what sort of tools they may need to counter those threats. Because frankly, it's hard to say. In today's day and age and environment, it's really, you just can't, read people's minds, and you can't look into a crystal ball. And I think from a sense of it's better to be more well prepared than underprepared, and then risk losing, further potential life. That's how I view it. Again, I can't speak for the individual law enforcement agencies. Any other questions?
Do you have any observations at this point about ag terrorism? That doesn't get much play in any of the conversations, but being an ag state, we're obviously potentially more vulnerable than many.
It does, and that's one of the things that comes up at our senior advisory committee meetings when we actually have Dr. Tedrow and Dr. Odekoven from Animal Industry Board. They actually sit in on our meetings, and so that's one of the things we try to bring to the forefront, because realistically, yeah, that has sort of fallen off. How viable is it? I believe there's reports out there that, before the fall of Al-Qaeda, they were looking at how can we address the food sector through agriculture. So obviously there's issues we're looking at, like the anthrax or basically human-created crop disease. It is something that actually does fall under our strategy to look at. And so where possible, we do actually provide some funding for looking at ag. I know in the past 2 years, at least since I've been on this job, we've actually provided funding for training to the Animal Industry Board, dealing with, I believe the last one was to do with fowl, looking at the fowl. And then there's some other training coming up in December, which we've also provided funding for. So it's not totally fallen off our radar. I hope I answered your question.
Steve, I'd like to ask about the energy grid, what's being done to protect that. Not to say we're going to have a terrorist attack on our energy grid, but I'm just curious. And then infectious diseases.
Okay. Well, I'll go with the energy grid. There are people at DHS, and maybe not that well advertised, but they do have the grid exercises, perhaps you heard of, where they have the large energy corporations. They get into the exercise, and DHS helps run that to see, okay, how are we going to attack this, either from a major power failure issue, either from a terrorist attack or a cyber event. So they do practice those sorts of things. From the infectious diseases, I will tell you that Department of Health here, we do have folks that do sit on our senior advisory committee, so we do have that interaction. If you remember when we had the Ebola scare, and I'm not giving out any privacy information, but one of the concerns was, how are we going to handle if someone coming into this country is actually going to be, how are we going to monitor them without doing HIPAA violations? And so we did work that out. So we actually do work with Department of Health. One of the other things that we are doing, I mentioned earlier, the retired firefighter, John Groen, who actually is working part-time in the Fusion Center, he goes to the regional health meetings. So that way, if there is something that is impacting the state, either from a health perspective, or if it's some information that needs to go out, perhaps it's a bad batch of drugs and people are showing up at the hospital, so that information connection is there that we can make that. Hopefully that answered your question.
With the power grid too, I'd just add on the electric and the cyber areas. With President Obama, that's been a major recruitment effort. One way that the federal government responds or helps to prepare is by doing waves of recruitment in certain skill sets, and you'll see that through their hiring practices, and then they reach the stage of running their practice events. Yeah,
I wish I could remember the gentleman's name, but he actually helped start the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland and Defense Security Studies, and we actually had him at our Homeland Security conference about 2 years ago, but he was almost like the expert on power grid, and he was quite adamant about how states should be prepared and what they should do. So that is something that has not fallen off the radar. If you take a look at the whole concept of DHS and looking at the United States, they've identified 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and power being one of them, and then you're talking about water, wastewater, transportation, agriculture, chemicals, communications, and the list goes on. They actually have people that are assigned to look at all of those specific critical infrastructures and see where the threats are, how we can mitigate those threats. So it's not a lost thought. There are people that are working on that. And I think part of that too is basically it's what's going on in the world, what the media reports on at that time that raises that people's level of interest in that particular area. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
I know there was a school shooting here in South Dakota maybe about a month ago around Harrisburg region. How do you guys go about like supporting that and covering it and kind of going around the whole information about like how you guys like adjust for those sort of problems?
Okay, well, I will tell you this, that realistically, it's up to each individual school district to address their security policies. Back in 2013, we partnered with Department of Homeland Security and sent out close to 200 school safety security guides as far as looking at not only that type of event, but what happens if it's a natural event and going through those sorts of plans and checklists. In terms of addressing that particular issue, I did sit in on a couple of post briefings that were conducted by the staff from Harrisburg, and they actually sort of went to the forefront and came up with some best practices that they learned as a result of that, which they actually shared with their fellow school administrators, which I thought was very good. What we're working on now with Department of Education, and it's a little bit of a process, is to actually revamp that school safety guide that was issued in 13 and looking at some of these best case practices and implement that, and then perhaps sending that out again. Again, I'm looking at, these are 140 some individual school districts, everything from the size of Sioux Falls to perhaps, you know, one school in a very remote community, so you have differing levels of what the security plan may entail. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So, switching gears here again, as far as what can you do? What I'm going to focus here on specifically now is looking at anti-terrorism. When you have these terrorist events, and the experts say there's typically 8 steps that go through when these terrorist events happen. The first one is surveillance. Unless this person gets up one day and decides, I want to go kill a bunch of people, if it's a terrorist event, they're typically going to conduct some sort of surveillance on their target. This is one area where perhaps if law enforcement gets information from you, the concerned citizen, that, hey, something's not right, I got a guy out here taking pictures of the dam, but yet it's not specifically the dam they're taking pictures of. They're taking pictures of the security camera. They're taking pictures of the entrance. They're taking pictures of how to get in and how to get out. They're taking pictures of control. It could even be a sporting event, an arena. So they'll typically do some surveillance to identify their target as far as strengths and weaknesses in which place they can actually attack. Second thing is elicitation. This also covers information gathering. They may be asking security folks or workers specific questions not necessarily related to the interest. Like, say, for example, well, how many people do you have on staff here during the day? When do you lock the doors? What are your hours of operation? You know, who comes in to check at night? What are your cybersecurity practices? Are there alarms that go to a company? Do they go directly to a law enforcement agency? So there's some sort of elicitation going on as part of that information gathering. Third thing they'll do is test security. They might plant a bag by the door, see who notices, or perhaps even call in, see perhaps how long it takes law enforcement to respond, take a look at and see if fire is going to respond. So there is some sort of test, because obviously they want to see how long they can get away with their action before help is going to arrive. Funding. Doesn't matter what they do. Every operation needs funding. So how do they do their funding? Could be drug deals, could be thefts, could be burglaries, selling stolen property, whatever the case may be. Obviously, the more sophisticated the level of terrorists, they're not necessarily, may not be stooping to these sort of low-level crimes, but the majority of the fact is that they are going to need funds from somewhere in order to buy their supplies and their equipment. Another one's acquiring supplies. Say, for example, if you have, you know, a person going in and buying a bunch of peroxide, but yet they may not be in the haircutting business, you know. So it's basically, if they're going in and buying all these pieces of cut pipe, but yet they're not a plumber. They're buying a lot of gunpowder. They're not reloading ammunition. They're not an outdoor sportsman. those sorts of things, possibly draw suspicions, to people that are selling these things to them. So things to just look out for. And then impersonation, they could steal ID, they could go into gym lockers, steal ID, break windows, steal police uniforms, steal EMS uniforms, or for that matter, steal passports and then try to use those. So there is some impersonation involved here. And then lastly, rehearsal. They may try to rehearse the act going through before they actually commit the act itself. And then lastly, deployment. When they deploy, pretty much they're already on scene and they're ready to strike. So those are the 8 signs. Where do you come in? Recognize those signs. See, if you do see something, suspicious, what I'd suggest is actually if you see something, say something. It's part of that national campaign. And what I'm referring to here is we have an 844 number that you can call. Keep in mind, it's not to replace 911. If you have a life-threatening emergency, crime in progress, unattended package, perhaps by a mass gathering, that's still 911. What I'm talking about here is like, well, I saw this guy, he was loading crates into his trunk in the middle of the night, and they had military markings on them, and I really didn't want to call 911 because it's not an emergency, and I don't feel comfortable talking to my police department or whatever the case may be. We'll take that information. We actually have trained people that can take that information down. And if you're asking where does that information go, this is how the process works. The trained operators will take that information down, they'll pass it over to the Fusion Center. Fusion Center evaluates that information to see if it matches up with any other suspicious activity that may be taking place across the United States. They take a look at it, they vet it, and then depending on the nature, keep in mind there may be some follow-up questions, some follow-up interview, then they'll pass it to the Joint Terrorism Task Force for further investigation. So it's not like this information is going to be going and it's going to be sitting in someone's desk and not have anything done with it. So every piece of information that does come in is followed up on. Here's part of the campaign. Recently, we had National Park Service join on with the South Dakota number. Keep in mind, this number is specific to South Dakota. It is answered here in the state. People are familiar with the state, so they can ask the pertinent questions. I did leave a box with key tags at the back of the table, so has the phone number on them. So as you go out, grab as many as you want. I got enough of them. Bottom line is this. It's a changing environment. It's a changing world. We face a lot of threats, not to mention just the bad weather alone. We don't need people coming into the state and trying to kill us. And the thing that you can do is you can become involved. It's if you see something that just doesn't look right, you know what your home looks like, you know what the street looks like, or the road, or whatever the case may be, you know what looks out of place. If it's that thing that looks out of place and raises the hair on your neck, just don't brush it off. If you have some suspicions, it's better to call. No one's going to yell at you. No one's going to scream at you. It's better to get that suspicion relayed to someone so that if there is something, it can be followed on, because who knows, things can be, prevented. I know there was some stuff out in the media that said with this recent attack in San Bernardino that people were afraid to call because they didn't want to look like they were profiling. We're not asking for you to call just because someone has a different color of a skin or believes in a different religion or has a different viewpoint. What we're looking at is behaviors. We're looking at behaviors that basically tend to rise to that suspicion, not necessarily a particular race or ethnicity. So I hope that makes sense. Any questions? I'm glad to answer them.
Sure.
Hi, Dan Monk with Mitchell Tech. I also serve as Chief of Security for Mitchell Tech and the Mitchell School District. I'm also on the Local Emergency Planning Committee. The question I have is in your 2013 school safety recommendations that came out, you suggested during an active shooter situation, sheltering is in place, assuming a good dose of situational awareness and common sense. Do you expect that to change in your next round?
Well, I think it has changed already, because now what DHS has put out with the FBI, 3K things, run, hide, fight. And so the first thing being, and that's why I think people should be aware of their environment. It doesn't matter if you're in school here on campus, you're out at the mall, or you're at a shopping department store. Know your environment, look at the exits, identify the exits, and then find a place that you think that if something were to happen, that you could run to. With the hide, if you can lock a door, put a barrier between yourself, and keep in mind that if someone's shooting with a rifle, the bullets will go through the walls, so the more material between you and that person outside, the better. So you either hide and then as last resort fight. I've actually been to a school where they've adopted the run, hide, fight theme. And as part of their fight, they actually put a bunch of pool balls in a bucket for the students, so that way if the person were somehow to break through, if they were hiding, they'd pummel them with pool balls. So, you know, innovative, but at least they're thinking about, hey, what could we do if something like this happens? So run, hide, fight, 3 key things. DHS has a video online. It's free, and you can take a look at it. It's about 6 minutes. It's actually very well done. I actually did that presentation for Department of Education last week because they're also looking at things like disgruntled constituents coming in and trying to address some of their safety concerns. They also have, I will tell you this, another resource for you is DHS FEMA also has some online training. You can get credit for that. You have to register as a student, gives you a student ID number, but there are several courses, a variety of interests, everything to do with anti-terrorism that you can take a look at. It is free. The only thing you have to do is invest some time.
Any remaining questions? Just a moment left for your last chance to do so if you do.
Please grab some key tags on your way out.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you much for coming. Please, yes, thank the director. Appreciate it.